That was a very exciting worship this morning. Has me energized. We're jumping right back into Nehemiah. And I don't know what Vince said the first week exactly, or Dave last week, as I was in and out of things. But we did Nehemiah as a staff. Every Tuesday morning, we have devotions together, like a small group of the church staff. And earlier this year, we did Nehemiah for like 13 weeks or some ridiculously long amount of time. We really broke it down and went through it bit by bit. And we were excited to do this then for the church and break it into 4 weeks from 13. So we're trying to get a lot in a little bit of time. But Pastor Vince started a couple weeks ago and challenged everybody to think about a burden that God has placed on their hearts, something in their life, something that they see, some need that they see, or trouble that they see, that God has given them a burden on their heart to do something about. And then last week, Pastor Dave talked about how when Nehemiah got that burden, he didn't just jump right into action and build the plane in the air, as Pastor Dave likes to say. He took some time to pray about it and get together with God and make sure that he had some plans and that he was on the same timeline as God. And so where we pick up this week and what I want to talk about this week is how Nehemiah then took that burden and that vision and how he put it into action. And there's a few really important lessons that we can learn about how Nehemiah went through this process. So Nehemiah saw the problem. The wall of his city, his ancestor city, was destroyed, so they were open for attacks and they weren't safe. And he could have done what we often do, is thought, man, somebody should really do something about that, and let it end at that. Or sometimes we go a little bit further and we think, I should do something about that. And then nothing goes on from there. How many times have you been driving along? I know it happens to Julie and I often. We're driving along and we think about something, or we hear something on the radio, or we see something and we think, oh, when I get home, I'm going to research this and see what I can do to help or whatever. And then, we end up at Applebee's and we have dinner, and then we go shopping, and then we remember something the kids need for school and go back shopping again to get it. And next thing you know, we're home and in bed and we've forgotten all about that thing that we saw and we thought, man, we should do something about that. Nehemiah didn't. He was able to see it, sit on it a little bit and pray with God about it, and then figure out the steps that he needed to make it happen. Now, sometimes we get into this problem, and I know I have too, when I think that maybe God could just do it on his own without me. That God could, if he wanted this problem solved, well, then he could just do it. He's God, right? He could just make it happen. But the first teaching note and the first thing that Nehemiah teaches us here is that God isn't going to do the work for us. He's going to guide us in the work. He's going to show us the work that we need to do. All right, sometimes we think, oh, there's this problem and God could just solve it, on his own with the snap of his fingers. But God isn't going to do it for us. He's going to show us what we need to do to make it happen. And so the first thing that Nehemiah did that we read about in our scripture here was that he went to the king, because he knew that he needed the king's permission to be able to take the next steps in fulfilling the burden that God had given him. So he got everything together and he went to the king to get permission. And a little side note on this that I find encouraging for me, in verse 4, that Nehemiah was all ready. He knew what he was going to say. He had probably practiced it in the shower 10 times like I always do, ready to go in and talk to the king. Right? Before we have to go in and talk to our boss or talk to a teacher, or for the students go in and take a test, how often do we stop and pause and say a little prayer before we go in? I know I do it all the time, and it's encouraging for me to see that way back in Old Testament times, Nehemiah, in verse 4, before he went in, he stopped and paused and said a little prayer for God to be with him as he went in and talked to the king. So he went in, he made his request to the king. And God wasn't going to give the king a vision to build the wall, right? The king could have decided to rebuild that wall on his own. God could have given the king that burden and vision, but he didn't. He gave it to Nehemiah. And he wasn't going to just have the king automatically think, oh yes, that is what we should do. God didn't give the king the same burden. He gave it to Nehemiah, and Nehemiah had to go explain it to the king and get permission from the king. Just like we talked about in our teaching note, God didn't go ahead and do the work ahead of time for Nehemiah, but he prepared Nehemiah to do it, and he was right there with him while he was doing it. And that's a big difference. God didn't do it for him, but he prepared him to do it himself. I think that sometimes we pray or hope for a miracle when God is asking us to be that miracle for somebody. Nehemiah didn't pray for a miracle. He let God use him as the miracle. So a lot of you know, and if you don't, I will tell you now, that before we came to CrossPoint, our family had lived the previous 3 years in Haiti. And before that, for about 15 years, we had been working back and forth, flying back and forth to Haiti. We've also spent time in Nicaragua, just 2 weeks ago in Sierra Leone with Pastor Dave and his Julie, and some friends. And I also spent some time one summer in the Dominican Republic working with refugees on a sugar plantation. And I often hear from people, or people know that I have worked a lot in the developing world particularly with kids and kids in need. And sometimes people ask me, why doesn't God just do something about that? You know, I've been with a lot of kids that are suffering from malnutrition and hunger and all sorts of things. This one time, I was in the Dominican Republic working with those refugees, and we were doing something with all the kids because there was a program going on, like an educational thing for the parents. And so all day they needed people to watch different groups of kids. So my friend and I were there, and we said, hey, whatever group you want us to work with, just tell us. And the pastor said, oh, good, that room over there, we can't find anybody to be with those kids. Would you guys, be with those kids for the day? So we said, yeah, fine, whatever. So we went and we spent all day with those kids and, did crafts and games and fed them lunch and did naps and fed them a snack and did more games and all day long with these kids. And they were kind of sickly. They were coughing a lot and those kinds of things. But we just thought, maybe there's a cold going through the refugee camp, no big deal. So we do it all day. We're with these kids all day. The parents come and pick them up, and they go home. And then the pastor in charge comes up to us and puts his hand on my shoulder and says, thank you guys for being in that room with those kids today. We really have a hard time finding people willing to be in the room with all the kids with TB. And we thought, well, nice of you to tell us at the end of the day than before we started. But I'm fine. I didn't have TB. If I cough, you'll be okay. So I've been in a lot of settings with lots of suffering kids, and people will often say to me, and I've thought it myself at times, why doesn't God do something about that? But what I have learned and what we learn here in Nehemiah is that God has done something about that. He created the church. The answer is that God already did something about it. And what he did was he sent us, you and I, to do it. And that's our next teaching note there, that God sent us to do the work that brings about change. Back to the Nehemiah story, another thing that is good for us to know as we start to walk into the burdens that God has given us is that Nehemiah also had a plan of attack. He put all of his ducks in a row and got everything set up before he really started the project. Not only did he go to the king and get the king's permission to do it, which he had to do it first, but he also thought ahead and asked the king for letters to take to all of the governors for the areas he was going to, so they already knew that he had permission from the big boss to be there. He didn't have to re-explain and negotiate with all of them. And he also thought ahead even to the guy who's in charge of the woods that he would have to go through and get wood from to do the project, and asked the king for a letter for that person so that he had permission to do that. He thought ahead and had a contingency plan, or he planned for all the potential outcomes instead of just jumping in and doing it without thinking through all of those things. He even went to the wall at nighttime so that nobody could see him and get excited and wonder what he's doing. He went at nighttime to check it out, see exactly what the problems were, make an exact plan of who he wanted to do, what sections, and have it all scheduled out before he went to the people and told them what he was going to do. It's a good thing for us to learn as we walk into the burdens that God has given us and what we should do about it, to know that we should think through the details before beginning our work. There have been times when I have not thought through the details before I began something. I will give you one example. Years ago, 12 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, I'm not even sure exactly when, but I was in this slum in Haiti called Cité Soleil, which we have a picture of for you. One of the worst slums in the world. Mother Teresa visited Cité Soleil in the 90s and famously said that it is the place that God forgot. So I was there with a group of people, and we were going to be there for a couple of days working with kids in a school that a friend of ours ran in the slum. And I had this great idea that since we were there and the kids were hungry, that the second day, we were going to be there for 2 days, the second day we would feed all the kids a hot meal. We would buy all the stuff, we'd get some ladies to cook, we'd feed all the kids. I told all the kids on the first day, hey, tomorrow we're going to feed you when you come to school. And they were all excited, and I felt great. But I didn't think through everything. I didn't think through all the potential outcomes. I didn't figure all the details. I was just really excited to do it, and so jumped right in. I didn't follow the Nehemiah pattern very well. And so the second day came, and we hired some ladies. They cooked up all the food. It smelled great. Kids were excited. But what I didn't know or didn't plan on was that just because 200 kids were at school on Tuesday, you see where this is going, doesn't mean that after word got out that all the kids who came to school on Wednesday were going to get to eat, that only 200 kids were coming to school on Wednesday. Because it's not like a truancy officer that's going to come and knock on the door of your shack if your kid doesn't come to school. The school's there, and if you send your kids, great, and if you don't, also great. It's just when they come, they get taught. When they don't, they don't. But of course, when they were going to get fed, everybody wanted to come to school that day. And so I was not well prepared. We were not well prepared. And ended up with having to close the steel doors of the school and feed the kids that were inside, but having kids outside reaching their hands through the windows and under the doors, and all these hungry kids around the building, and parents mad and yelling and banging on the doors and the windows. And it was not fun time. And I created a big mess out of good intentions and a good burden that God had given me, but I didn't take these steps to think through the details and to plan it out and to think all of the things that could happen and have a plan for them. The last thing that we learn in this part of the Nehemiah story is that after he got the burden and he worked out the details and he prayed about it and he knew what he was going to do, then after that he went to the people. We started reading in verse 17. And that's when he got people excited about it. And he told them about it, and they were so excited, and they got on board, and they were happy to do their parts in the process. And that's our last note of things to remember to do with our burdens, is to inspire others to join you in making your vision a reality. You can accomplish more together. And so once Nehemiah had everything figured out, he thought through all of his contingencies, he had his details, he went and saw the wall, made sure he knew what he was talking about. Then he went to the people, and he got them excited and got them on board. Because none of us, whatever burden it is that God has put in our hearts, we're not likely to be able to accomplish it just by ourselves. We're going to need to get people excited and on board with us to do it. Right? We have a burden in this church that we've talked about many times for the kids in this community that go to Northside Elementary down the street. And so we had a burden to get them winter clothes because the guidance counselor and the principal told us that a lot of the kids come to school in the winter without coats and without gloves, and they can't go out to recess if they don't have them, and they're stuck inside, and the other kids go out and all these kinds of things. But the couple of us on staff can't provide all the coats and things like that. So we presented it to the church, and you guys have been great. Just in a couple of weeks, we have almost 6 bins full. And you can keep bringing the next 2 weeks. I want to fill up 10 bins if we can to take over there. But you see, when we join together on it, then we can accomplish so much more. And so that brings me to the last thing that I want to talk about this morning. And I'm wearing my super bright yellow Sierra Leone, Africa shirt this morning because I want to talk just a little bit about how this church has done that and followed this Nehemiah plan in Sierra Leone. So 10 years or so ago, a burden was given to some people here in the church to be a part of the lives of people in this tiny little village in Sierra Leone called Mbole. And they came together and then they prayed. They went and visited so they could come up with a plan, and came back here to this church and presented the plan, and people got excited, and you guys have been absolutely amazing over the last 10 years in supporting these awesome people in Mbole. So before going to Sierra Leone, when I was telling people that I was going to Sierra Leone, a lot of people didn't even necessarily really know that that was a real country, right? I could have told them I was going to Wakanda. They would have been right, same thing for a lot of them. Right? Who knows about Sierra Leone? Nobody, really? I told them where it was on the map. So Sierra Leone is this little country most people don't even know about. And then in Sierra Leone, we were in this town called Makeni, and we were talking with a missionary who grew up there, and she didn't even know where Mbole was. So this little country that nobody even really cares about, and even in the country, this little group of people that nobody even knows about, God gave a burden to this church for those 1,000 or so people in that village. And over the last 10 years, you have made an incredible difference in their lives. Pastor Dave gave a lot of information last week, and next Sunday evening at 6 o'clock in Brown Hall on the other side of that wall there, you guys are going to bring wonderful desserts, and we're going to share some more details for those that are interested in some of the details of that work. But I want to quickly highlight a couple of things to end my time here and what you guys have done in the past decade in Sierra Leone. So a little earlier this morning, because they're 4 hours ahead of us, but they had church in Mbole. And in this tiny little village of 60% Muslim and 40% Christian and probably 100%, some sort of animist belief mixed in there. It's Africa. It just is. Somewhere, those people this morning in that little village had church and were worshiping God in a building all together with a pastor who can pastor because you help pay his salary so that he can do that job and not have to do other jobs to feed his own kids during the week. And the love of Jesus and light of Jesus was in that village because of the work that you guys have done. There's a primary school, 270 or so kids will be at school Monday through Friday this week. And what we talked about a lot when we were just in Sierra Leone is it's so incredibly important to educate this particular young generation of kids. Because of civil war and some other things that have gone on there, their parents and definitely their grandparents are not educated. Right? So there's like an information gap or an education gap in there. And things that you learn in school aren't just like math and science and history, but you learn critical thinking skills as you're learning those things in elementary school. And there's a big hole in the society right now where some of the older folks who weren't able to go to school for reasons outside of their control don't have critical thinking skills and can't think forward and think ahead. So it's super important that we educate these children so that they can do that. The big change, I believe, in Mbole and Sierra Leone is going to come from the current generation of kids who are able to go to school. And you help make that happen for them every week. There's some kids that are older and go on to a secondary school, which costs money. And you guys are part of a scholarship program to send those kids, and they will really be the future leaders that will bring about lasting change in that community. Pastor Dave talked a little bit last week about the Women's Agricultural Program, which in a country where women in a lot of settings are seen as second-class citizens, and there's still all sorts of problems in that part of the world with women's rights and rights for girls and those sorts of things. You are part of empowering a group of women in this tiny village in Sierra Leone to be leaders in their community. And that is huge for them and for their children. So 2 last things I want to do, because I know my time is going away. I want to give you an update, and you can put that picture back up on the screen. Pastor Dave talked a little bit last week about a little girl whose life you were a part of saving. And so I got this picture from our guy, Harry. This is Mabinti, who Julie Beiser and I took to the hospital. We, I think, determined that it was probably her first time in a car that day. It may have been one of her first times ever out of tiny little Mabole village, and she was incredibly nervous. Except for when she was being examined by the doctor, and when Julie took her for her x-ray, when we were in there just consulting and talking and making a plan, she sat on my lap, and her heart was beating so fast that I could feel her heartbeat through her whole body the whole 2 hours we were sitting there. I kept saying to Julie and to Harry, wow, her heart is beating really, really fast. You can feel it. She was really nervous, but she made her way through. She had a procedure to get rid of that infection, and had last week for 3 days IV antibiotics, and she's taking oral for the next couple weeks. Then she'll go back to the surgeon for a follow-up. And because you sent us and you sent extra money along, that's all been prepaid for. Julie and I were able to prepay everything with donations that you had given. And talking with some doctor friends here this week, it's very likely that that infection would have ended up in her bone and then septic, and they probably still wouldn't have known what to do, so she would have just stayed at home and died, but now she's going to live, thanks to you and your work. So the last thing I'm going to do real quick is is play a little video because I want you to see the faces of some of the people that you've helped. Dave and Julie and Ken and Neil and others that have gone along know these names and know these faces, but for many of you, you're just hearing us talk about people you've never seen. So we're going to take just the last 2 minutes here and play a little video so you can see some of the people that we're talking about. All right, so those are some of the faces of some of the kids who you have been a part of helping and changing their lives over the last 10 years or so. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this morning. I thank you for each and every person that is here. I thank you for our awesome worship band this morning leading us in songs of praise. Lord, for all of the burdens that you have given people in this room, either over the course of this series or earlier in their lives, things that you've always put on their hearts and that have been on their minds, Lord, I pray that you now give us the steps. Help us to know the next steps to take to meet that burden that you've put on our hearts, Lord. I pray that all of us remember to think through the details and the plan ahead of time, and to know, Lord, that you have made us the answer to people's prayers. Instead of just snapping your fingers and making it happen, you've sent us to be the answer to their prayers. Lord, so I pray for all of us that you continue to touch our hearts, show us the people who you want us to reach out to and the needs that you want us to meet and the ways for us to be your hands and feet here in Harrisburg, around this area, around this country, and around the world in our partnerships in Sierra Leone and other places that you have given people in this church a burden for, Lord. We pray these things in your name. Amen.